A princess bargaining for a life in the shadows of a dying star is a dangerous game. But buying a ghost from an extinct species is a guaranteed death sentence. Princess Valeriana of the Ethelgard Empire had exactly 30 minutes to secure a disposable bodyguard before her own royal guard realized she was missing from the capital. The Outland Bazaar was a festering wound of a space station, hanging in the orbit of a shattered gas giant. It was a place where imperial law went to die, replaced by the cold, hard currency of black market tech and smuggled lives. Valeriana pulled her thermal cloak tighter around her shoulders, the adaptive fabric shifting to match the grimy, rust-stained bulkheads of the market's underbelly. She despised the stench of the bazaar, a suffocating mixture of ozone, synthetic narcotics, and unwashed alien bodies. But desperation had driven her from the pristine spires of her home world. A coup was brewing in the heart of Ethelgard. Lord Malachor, her father's most trusted advisor, was quietly moving his pieces across the galactic chessboard. Valeriana knew it. She had intercepted the encrypted data streams, saw the troop movements disguised as training exercises, and felt the sudden, chilling absence of her most loyal informants. Malachor was going to make a move for the throne, and Valeriana was the only obstacle left standing in his way. She needed a decoy, a wall of meat and bone to take the plasma fire that was inevitably coming for her tonight. She needed muscle that could not be bought by Malachor's endless coffers. She found her target at a slaver's auction block, tucked away in a damp, low-gravity sector of the station. The flesh peddler was a bloated, multi-limbed creature who spoke in a wet, guttural rasp, parading an assortment of captured mercenaries and debt slaves before a crowd of shadowy syndicates. Valeriana watched with cold detachment until the slaver hauled out a creature that made the entire room fall into a confused silence. It was a human. Valeriana leaned forward, her heart skipping a beat beneath her armored corset. Humanity had been wiped from the galactic registry centuries ago, their pale blue dots scorched to cinder during the first expansion wars. Yet, here one stood. He was tall, his musculature dense and sharply defined under layers of grime and old blood. His face was a stoic mask, eyes the color of forged steel staring straight ahead, completely detached from the humiliation of the auction block. What caught Valeriana's trained eye was not his rarity, but the intricate web of raised metallic scars wrapping around his spine and disappearing into the base of his skull. The slaver slapped the human on the back, boasting about the creature's high pain tolerance and mindless obedience, slapping a control collar around his neck. Valeriana noted the way the collar's indicator light flickered erratically when it touched his skin. The merchant claimed it was a minor atmospheric short circuit, but Valeriana recognized the subtle distortion of a dampening field fighting a power source it could not comprehend. She wondered what exactly was sleeping beneath that scarred flesh, and why a creature capable of shorting out a Class 4 restraint system was allowing itself to be sold for a handful of credits. She won the bid easily. The other buyers wanted hulking brutes or multi-armed enforcers, not a relic from a dead world. The slaver transferred the control tether to Valeriana's bracer, logging the human into her registry under the bleak designation of Subject 734. Valeriana immediately renamed him Rex in her internal logs, a private joke regarding the ancient kings of his ruined world. She did not speak to him. There was no time for introductions or pleasantries. She turned and walked briskly toward the docking bay where her stealth ship waited, expecting the human to drag his feet. Instead, Rex fell into step directly behind her, his footfalls utterly silent on the grated metal decking. He moved with a predatory grace that contrasted sharply with his heavy, battered frame. The route to Docking Bay 42 was a labyrinth of hanging neon cables and abandoned cargo containers. The ambient lighting flickered and died, plunging the corridor into deep shadows illuminated only by the faint, toxic glow of the gas giant outside the viewport. The ambush was perfectly executed. Valeriana's combat instincts flared a fraction of a second before the ceiling panels above them shattered inward. 4 figures dropped into the corridor, their bodies composed of a shifting liquid metal alloy that absorbed the ambient light. These were not common street thugs. They were Malakor's personal hounds, synthetic assassins programmed for absolute, silent eradication. The lead assassin lunged, its arm morphing into a monomolecular blade aimed directly at Valeriana's throat. She reached for the plasma pistol holstered at her thigh, knowing with sudden, terrifying clarity that she was going to be too slow. The assassin's blade sliced through the air, inches from her skin. Then the universe seemed to fracture. Rex did not draw a weapon. He simply stepped between Valeriana and the descending blade. The heavy magnetic restraints binding his wrist did not snap or break. They simply disintegrated into fine gray dust. He raised a single hand. The air around the assassin rippled violently, distorting the light like a heat wave. The synthetic killer, a machine built to withstand orbital re-entry, suddenly folded inward. Its liquid metal chassis buckled with a sickening crunch of warping alloy. Compressed into a jagged sphere the size of a fist by an invisible localized gravitational anomaly, the sphere dropped heavily to the floor, boring a hole straight through the reinforced decking from its sheer, impossible density. Valeriana stared, her breath caught in her lungs, as Rex turned his attention to the remaining 3 assassins. He moved faster than her optic enhancements could track. It was not mere physical speed. It was as if he was aggressively rewriting his own coordinates in space. He closed the distance to the second assassin, his palm striking the synthetic's chest. Instead of crushing it, Rex reversed the gravity well. The assassin was violently repelled backward, launching down the corridor with the velocity of a railgun slug, tearing through 3 solid steel blast doors before disappearing into the dark. The final 2 synthetics adapted instantly, their programming recognizing the catastrophic threat. They split apart, their limbs shifting into high-yield plasma casters. They opened fire simultaneously, filling the narrow corridor with a blinding crossfire of superheated energy. Rex did not dodge. He swept his arm in a wide arc. The plasma bolts halted in midair, suspended in a pocket of warped gravity, vibrating with contained fury. With a flick of his wrist, Rex redirected the suspended energy, sending the plasma fire tearing back into the assassins. The synthetics melted into glowing, useless slag. The entire engagement lasted less than 6 seconds. The corridor fell dead silent, save for the hiss of melting metal and the distant hum of the station's life support. Rex stood amidst the wreckage, his breathing even, his stoic expression entirely unchanged. The strange, cybernetic scars on his neck were glowing with a fierce, violet luminescence that slowly faded as the gravity around them stabilized. Valeriana looked at the pile of condensed metal, then at the smoking remains of the other assassins, and finally at the human she had purchased for the price of a cheap speeder bike. The control tether on her wrist bracer was completely dark, fried by the immense energy output. He was not bound to her. He was not a slave. She realized with a cold wave of absolute awe that she had not bought a decoy to take a bullet. She had inadvertently purchased a weapon of mass destruction from a species that was supposed to be nothing but cosmic ash. And as Rex turned his cold, steel-colored eyes toward her, waiting for an order she no longer had the power to enforce, Valeriana realized her fight for the throne had just become a war. A stealth ship designed to be a ghost in the void is only useful if the people inside it are not already dead. Valeriana sprinted through the final stretch of the docking bay, her pulse pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Behind her, Rex moved with that same unnerving, silent grace, leaving no trace of the slaughter they had just escaped. The boarding ramp of her personal vessel, the Nightfall, hissed open at the encrypted proximity ping from her bracer. They barely cleared the airlock before Valeriana slammed her palm against the emergency launch panel. The ship detached violently from the station's umbilical, its dark matter engines burning a silent, invisible streak into the cosmos. Once they were in deep space, cruising on sublight engines. Valeriana turned to the human. Her royal training demanded she project absolute authority, but her hands were still shaking from the sheer, unadulterated violence of the encounter. She pointed a slender, armored finger toward the ship's automated medical bay, a sterile white room filled with scanning arches and diagnostic beds. She needed to know exactly what kind of monster she had dragged onto her ship. Rex did not argue or ask questions. He stripped off his grimy upper tunic without a word of modesty, tossing the ruined fabric aside. It revealed a torso that looked like a battleground of flesh and machine. Valeriana activated the deep tissue scanners, stepping back as the machine hummed to life. The holographic display above the diagnostic bed flared, rendering Rex's internal structure in glowing, translucent blue. Valeriana gasped, her eyes widening as the data streamed across the monitors. This was not a standard slave augmentation, nor was it the crude cybernetics used by deep space pirates. His entire skeletal structure was laced with a dark, interwoven metal that defied standard periodic tables, absorbing the scanner's energy rather than reflecting it. His nervous system was braided with synthetic neuropathways that pulsed with dormant, terrifying energy. It was banned technology. It was ancient Earth engineering that the Ethelgard Empire had spent centuries trying to erase from the galactic history books. The Imperial Archives classified human technology as crude and barbaric. Yet the elegance of the gravity manipulation nodes embedded at the base of his skull was light years ahead of anything the finest Imperial scientists could dream up. He was a living, breathing testament to a forgotten war, a biological superweapon masquerading as cheap labor. Rex sat up from the scanner, seemingly bored by the revelation of his own weaponized biology. He walked past the stunned princess and headed straight for the ship's galley. He rummaged through the pristine storage cabinets, ignoring the exotic delicacies imported from a dozen garden worlds. Instead, he ripped open a sealed foil packet of high-density nutrient paste meant strictly for emergency survival situations. He squeezed the bland, gray sludge into his mouth with absolute indifference, his steel-colored eyes scanning the ship's layout. Valeriana crossed her arms, her regal composure fighting a losing battle against sheer disbelief. She demanded to know his origins, her tone dripping with the high-born arrogance of a ruler addressing a lowly subject. She expected fear, or at least the reverence owed to the crown. Rex simply chewed, swallowed, and pointed a ration-stained finger at her ornate, segmented armor. He told her in a flat, gravelly voice that her ceremonial cape was a severe tactical liability, and her tightly laced corset was restricting the oxygen flow required for high-stress combat evasion. Valeriana blinked, utterly thrown off balance. She was a princess of 1,000 star systems, and a slave from a dead world was deadpan critiquing her wardrobe while eating survival paste. She decided to ignore the insult, focusing instead on the small, scorched memory drive she had pried from the chassis of the lead synthetic assassin before they fled the station. She plugged the drive into the Nightfall's primary decryption console. The ship's advanced core computer chewed through the damaged, military-grade encryption for agonizing minutes. When the data finally populated the main view screen, the blood drained from Valeriana's face, leaving her pale and trembling. It was a secure, encrypted communication from Lord Malachor to his elite guard commanders. The text scrolled across the screen, detailing a highly successful breach of the Imperial sanctum. The Emperor, her father, was dead. Malachor had orchestrated a silent, flawless assassination, introducing a synthetic neurotoxin into the royal life support feed. But the horror did not end there. The data cache contained a pre-recorded broadcast scheduled for the morning cycle across all Imperial channels. The broadcast featured expertly manipulated security footage showing Valeriana herself tampering with the life support systems. Malachor was not just stealing the throne, he was turning the entire galaxy against her, painting her as a patricidal traitor and securing his own legitimacy as the grieving savior of the Empire. Grief and rage waged a bitter war in her chest, a heavy stone of sorrow threatening to pull her under. But the proximity alarms of the nightfall screamed to life, a blaring siren that cut her mourning violently short. The tactical display flashed an angry, flashing red. A massive spatial distortion was tearing open just off their port bow, the fabric of space buckling under immense mass. It was an Ethelgard dreadnought, a kilometer-long engine of destruction bristling with heavy plasma batteries, railguns, and tractor beams. Malachor had not just sent assassins to the black market. He had positioned a capital warship nearby to ensure she never made it out of the sector alive. The nightfall was incredibly fast and completely invisible to standard long-range sensors. But the dreadnought had dropped out of hyperspace right on top of them, catching them squarely in its visual and localized gravitational net. Valeriana threw herself into the pilot's seat, her fingers flying across the navigation console in a desperate blur to calculate an emergency micro-jump. The computer spat back a brutal, unforgiving truth. Spooling the dark matter hyperdrive would take 60 seconds. The dreadnought's targeting systems were already locking on, and its weapons would vaporize them in exactly 30 seconds. She braced for the inevitable, the bitter taste of defeat and unjust death rising in her throat. But a heavy, scarred hand pushed her gently aside. Rex stood over the central navigation console. He did not look at the glowing touchscreens or the frantic, flashing warning lights. He placed both of his bare hands flat against the cold, smooth metal of the ship's primary nav column. The strange, violet luminescence returned. It flared to life across the metallic scars on his neck, pulsing with a heartbeat of its own, and spread down the thick musculature of his arms. The air in the cockpit grew impossibly dense, pressing against Valeriana's eardrums and tasting sharply of ozone and burning copper. Rex closed his eyes, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute concentration. He was not using the ship's computer. He was directly interfacing with the Nightfall's dark matter core through his own augmented nervous system, a biological bridge to a mechanical heart. The ship groaned, the reinforced hull plating shuddering under a sudden localized gravitic stress that the engineering specifications said should tear the vessel into microscopic shrapnel. Outside the viewport, the dreadnought unleashed a blinding, relentless volley of heavy plasma torpedoes, turning the void of space into a searing wall of blue fire aimed directly at the Nightfall. They never hit. Rex violently ripped a hole in the fabric of space-time, not by calculating a complex trajectory, but by physically forcing the universe to fold around them using sheer willpower and forbidden technology. The Nightfall snapped out of reality a fraction of a second before the torpedoes detonated, leaving nothing behind but a lingering, impossible echo of Earth's forgotten power rippling through the void. Where they would end up, and how a human survived the neural feedback of a starship engine, were questions that would have to wait. Tearing through the fabric of space with a human nervous system acting as a hyperdrive was a gamble that ended in a catastrophic shower of sparks. The Nightfall exited the improvised slipstream like a skipped stone, violently colliding with the upper atmosphere of a dead, ice-locked moon. The ship's primary engines choked and died, leaving them at the mercy of the celestial body's crushing gravity well. Valeriana fought the dead controls, her knuckles white, managing only to angle their descent enough to avoid turning into a localized crater. The stealth ship slammed into a vast glacier, tearing a mile-long trench through the ancient ice before grinding to a violent, shuddering halt. Silence descended, broken only by the hiss of venting coolant and the groaning of warped hull plating. Valeriana unbuckled her crash webbing, her body aching from the sheer kinetic trauma of the impact. Rex was already standing. He had ripped the heavy steel crash harness from his seat entirely, his breathing completely steady. They had blindly jumped to an uncharted sector. But Valeriana recognized the jagged, frozen mountain range looming in the distance from old Imperial star charts. It was Aegis Prime, a forgotten outpost moon holding a heavily fortified royal safe house built by her paranoid grandfather. It was meant to be a tomb for secrets, buried under miles of permanent winter. But today, it was their only chance at survival. Stepping out of the airlock was like stepping into a physical wall of agony. The surface temperature was hostile enough to shatter standard alloys, and the wind carried jagged microscopic ice crystals that flayed exposed skin. Valeriana activated her thermal cloak, the advanced microweaves generating a localized heat shield. Rex, however, possessed only the thin salvaged flight jacket he had stripped from the ship's emergency locker. He should have frozen solid in 3 minutes. Instead, the metallic webbing beneath his skin pulsed with a faint, warming violet glow, his engineered biology overriding the lethal environment. The trek to the mountain ridge was a brutal test of endurance. The terrain was a nightmare of hidden crevasses and razor-sharp ice outcroppings. The storm intensified, reducing visibility to a mere handful of feet. Valeriana struggled, her high-born physiology unaccustomed to the raw, unfiltered violence of a hostile biosphere, when a sudden, violent gust of wind threatened to sweep her off a narrow ice bridge. Rex caught her arm with crushing, unwavering strength. He pulled her flush against his chest, acting as a living windbreak. He did this continuously over the next 2 hours, when a massive stalactite of ice snapped from an overhead ridge, plummeting toward Valeriana like a heavy spear. Rex did not hesitate. He lunged, placing his own body between the princess and the falling debris. The ice shattered against his shoulder with bone-breaking force, dropping him to one knee, but he absorbed the entire blow. Valeriana stared at him through the blinding snow, shocked by the total disregard for his own survival. She asked him why he took the hit when his localized gravity shield could have deflected it. Rex stared back, wiping a trickle of crimson blood from his chin. He stated in a flat, deadpan voice that deploying a gravity shield on an unstable glacial shelf would have caused a seismic chain reaction, burying them both. Furthermore, he noted her ornate, high-heeled combat boots were a profound architectural failure for mountain climbing, making her a severe tactical liability that required manual shielding. Valeriana actually laughed, a short, breathless sound stolen by the wind. It was a bizarre, grating humor, but it cracked the icy armor of her terror. His actions were rooted in strict, protective calculations. Yet the way his hand lingered on her shoulder before they kept moving spoke of a burgeoning, unprogrammed instinct to simply keep her safe. They finally reached the heavy, frost-covered blast doors of the safe house, carved directly into the bedrock of the mountain. Valeriana pressed her palm against the genetic scanner. The ancient machinery groaned, recognizing the royal bloodline, and the massive doors parted to reveal a dark, cavernous interior. As they stepped inside and the doors sealed shut behind them, the howling wind was replaced by the low, comforting hum of subterranean geothermal heaters roaring to life. The safe house was Spartan but functional, stocked with decades-old rations and weapon caches. But as the emergency lights flickered on, casting a warm amber glow across the room, Rex suddenly collapsed. His massive frame hit the durasteel floor hard. Valeriana rushed to his side, rolling him over. The violent interface with the Nightfall's dark matter core, combined with the brutal trek, had pushed his cybernetics to the breaking point. A thick synthetic violet fluid was leaking rapidly from a cracked neural port at the base of his neck, sizzling as it hit the floor panels. He was losing biocoolant, his internal systems burning up from the inside out. Valeriana dragged him to a long metal staging table, stripping off his ruined jacket. She located a heavy trauma kit in the corner of the room, pulling out a microscopic soldering iron, synthetic bonding agents, and a dampening cloth. She stood over him, her hands trembling. To repair the port, she had to peel back the synthetic skin masking the hardware. As she did, the profound moral rot of her empire was laid bare beneath her fingertips. The neural port was not a clean surgical enhancement. It was a brutal, jagged invasion of metal fused directly into his spinal column, designed to inflict maximum agony if the control chip was defied. The Ethelgard Empire had built its sprawling, beautiful utopia on the backs of millions of enslaved beings, justifying it as the natural order of the cosmos. Looking at the sheer, calculated cruelty inflicted upon this man, Valeriana felt a sickening wave of guilt. She was a beneficiary of this suffering. She leaned in close, the scent of ozone, copper, and his sweat filling her senses. She carefully cleaned the leaking port, her fingers gently bracing his neck. Rex was awake, his jaw clenched tight, but he did not make a single sound as the searing heat of the micro-soldering iron fused the broken conduits back together. Valeriana kept her eyes focused on the work, her breath ghosting across his skin. She whispered an apology, not just for the searing heat of the tool, but for the chains her people had placed on him. Rex turned his head slightly, his steel eyes locking onto hers. The proximity was sudden and electric. He told her quietly that apologies were inefficient data, incapable of altering past events, but his voice lacked its usual mechanical flatness. It was raw, carrying a weight of centuries of isolation. Valeriana met his gaze, refusing to look away. The master and the slave ceased to exist in that dusty subterranean room. There was only a woman who had lost her father and a warrior who had lost his world, finding a strange, quiet gravity in one another. She sealed the synthetic skin, her thumb lingering against the pulse point of his neck, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. A profound, unspoken connection sparked in the heavy air between them, terrifying and entirely real. As she stepped back, wiping her hands, a chilling thought crossed her mind. If the Earth was truly reduced to a cinder centuries ago, who had the resources and the unfathomable technology to secretly engineer a weapon like Rex? And how many more were waiting in the dark? She did not have time to ponder the mystery. The comforting hum of the safe house was suddenly pierced by a shrill, piercing klaxon. The amber emergency lights flared violently into a strobing, aggressive red. Valeriana sprinted to the main security console, wiping a layer of frost from the primary monitor. The exterior sensor grid was lighting up with dozens of hostile contacts. Malachor had not lost them in the blind jump. He had tracked the impossible gravitational wake of Rex's jump straight to Aegis Prime. The monitor displayed heavily armored drop pods smashing into the glacier outside, disgorging packs of sleek, quadrupedal machines. Tracker hounds. They were the most relentless siege weapons in the Imperial arsenal, designed to hunt, corner, and shred their prey in the most unforgiving environments in the galaxy. The intimate, quiet sanctuary had instantly become a steel coffin. Valeriana looked back at Rex. He was already standing, rolling his shoulders as the violet light flared to life along his spine once more. A dark, terrifying promise of the violence to come. A locked, reinforced door is only a comforting thought until a pack of Imperial tracker hounds starts chewing through its molecular bonds. For Princess Valeriana, the agonizing shriek of melting durasteel was the terrifying sound of her imminent death. But for the human standing beside her, it was merely an irritating noise complaint. Rex tilted his head, watching the heavy blast doors of the safe house glow a furious cherry red as the hound's plasma jaws chewed through the exterior shielding. The safe house was compromised, a static trap waiting to be sprung. Valeriana's mind raced through a dozen failed tactical scenarios, her royal composure threatening to shatter completely. Her grandfather had built this bunker to withstand a localized orbital strike, but he had never accounted for the sheer, relentless savagery of Malicor's elite hunter squadrons. She turned to Rex, her breathing shallow and fast, expecting him to brace for a final, desperate stand in the center of the room. Instead, Rex was calmly inspecting a seemingly blank section of the rear rock face. Running his scarred fingers over the frozen stone, he stated in a flat, clinical tone that the architectural blueprints of paranoid monarchs typically included a secondary egress route, as cornering oneself in a subterranean box was a statistical guarantee of mortality. Before Valeriana could process the deadpan critique of her family's engineering choices, Rex drove his fist into the rock. He did not use sheer force. A concentrated pulse of violent, violet gravity erupted from his knuckles, shattering a massive false wall of compressed ice and stone. A dark, gaping tunnel was revealed, leading deep into the labyrinthine glacial caverns of Aegis Prime. The air that rushed out was impossibly cold, carrying the ancient, stale scent of the moon's frozen core. The heavy blast doors of the main entrance finally gave way with a deafening groan, collapsing inward in a shower of molten slag. 4 quadrupedal tracker hounds poured into the room, their sleek, chrome bodies moving with unnatural insectoid grace. Behind them, heavily armored hunter commandos stepped through the smoke, their thermal visors glowing a sickly green in the dim light. Rex grabbed Valeriana by the armored waist of her combat corset, practically lifting her off her feet, and threw them both into the dark breach just as a volley of high-yield suppression fire shredded the staging table where he had been lying moments before. The chase through the ice caverns was a nightmare of vertical drops, razor-sharp stalagmites, and suffocating darkness. The internal temperature of the tunnels was dropping rapidly, testing the limits of Valeriana's thermal cloak. She ran blindly, trusting the crushing, unyielding grip of Rex's hand pulling her forward. The hounds were fast, their metallic claws tearing into the ice with terrifying efficiency, their sensor packages easily tracking the residual heat of their prey. Valeriana felt a rising tide of panic. They were being herded, pushed deeper into a dead-end glacial shelf. She gasped for air, her lungs burning, and told Rex that standard Imperial evasion tactics dictated they find high ground and bottleneck the pursuers. Rex did not break his stride. He glanced back over his shoulder, his steel eyes reflecting the faint, bouncing beams of the hunter's targeting lasers. He replied dryly that Imperial evasion tactics were fundamentally flawed because they assumed the prey was incapable of altering the fundamental laws of physics. He added that the hunter's reliance on linear pursuit vectors was embarrassingly predictable, treating the life-or-death scenario as a mild inconvenience in his daily routine. His utter lack of fear was infectious. Valeriana found her panic receding, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. She tapped into her bracer, syncing her personal interface with the short-range comms the hunters were using. She could not decrypt their audio, but she could track the localized telemetry bursts of their squad formation. She warned Rex that they were splitting up, flanking them through parallel ice tubes to execute a pincer movement. Rex stopped abruptly at the edge of a massive subterranean chasm. A narrow, fragile bridge of blue ice spanned the abyss, disappearing into the gloom on the other side. Below them was nothing but a bottomless drop into the moon's frozen mantle. The mechanical shrieks of the hounds echoed loudly from the tunnels directly behind them. Instead of crossing the bridge, Rex turned to face the advancing threat. He instructed Valeriana to step back and cover her ears. The first 2 hounds burst from the tunnel, their mechanical jaws snapping, accelerating toward Rex with lethal intent. The human did not deploy a weapon. He crouched low and pressed both palms flat against the smooth ice of the cavern floor. The violet circuitry pulsing beneath his skin flared blindingly bright, casting harsh, moving shadows against the cavern walls. He did not target the hounds. He targeted the environment. A massive wave of gravitational distortion rippled outward from his hands, instantly nullifying the friction and gravity on the top layer of the ice. The charging hounds lost their footing entirely. Their forward momentum betrayed them. Unable to grip the surface, the two lethal machines spun out of control, their legs flailing uselessly in zero gravity before they slid directly over the edge of the chasm, vanishing into the dark with a fading, mechanical screech. The hunters were smarter. 3 commandos emerged from the flanking tunnels, their thermal rifles raised and locked onto Rex's chest. They fired a synchronized volley of hyper-accelerated kinetic rounds. Rex raised his right hand, twisting his wrist sharply. The air in front of him solidified into a dense, localized gravity shield. The kinetic rounds hit the invisible barrier and flattened instantly, dropping to the ice as harmless, deformed lumps of lead. Rex did not wait for them to reload. He extended his left hand toward a massive, jagged stalactite hanging directly above the hunters. With a vicious downward pull, he intensified the gravitational pull on the ancient ice formation by a factor of 50. The stalactite sheared off the ceiling with the force of a falling meteor. It crushed 2 of the commandos instantly, burying them beneath tons of unbreakable blue ice. The final hunter, the squad leader, realized his tactical error too late. He abandoned his rifle and turned to sprint back into the tunnel, engaging his suit's emergency thrusters. Rex was faster. He closed the distance in 3 massive, unnatural strides, his speed warping the air around him. He grabbed the hunter by the back of his heavily armored neckplate, hauling the man backward and slamming him violently against the frozen cavern wall. Rex engaged a localized gravity pin, pressing the commando against the rock with the weight of a small ground transport. The hunter gasped, his reinforced ribs groaning dangerously under the invisible pressure. Valeriana stepped forward, her plasma pistol drawn and leveled directly at the visor of the pinned hunter. The adrenaline was singing in her veins. She was no longer a fleeing royal. She was an apex predator closing in for the kill. She demanded to know Malakor's immediate timeline. She needed to know exactly when the false evidence of her treason was going to be broadcast to the Imperial Senate. The hunter laughed, a wet, rattling sound through his suit's external speakers. He spat a curse at the princess, boasting that she was already too late. He revealed that Lord Malakor was not waiting for the morning cycle. The assassination of the emperor had accelerated his plans. The coronation ceremony and the public execution of Valeriana's remaining loyalist generals was scheduled for the very next dawn. In less than 12 hours, Malakor would have absolute control of the planetary defense grid and the undivided loyalty of the Ethelgard Armada. Valeriana's blood ran cold. 12 hours. Aegis Prime was in a remote sector, even with a fully functional dark matter drive. A standard transit to the capital world would take 10 hours, leaving them no time to infiltrate the heavily fortified palace, bypass the orbital blockade, and present her counter-evidence to the High Council. Rex looked at the princess, his expression unreadable, before applying a fraction more pressure to the hunter's chest plate. The man fell unconscious instantly, his suit's medical telemetry screaming a warning. Rex let the man slump to the floor, releasing the gravity pin. He turned to Valeriana, brushing a layer of frost from his scarred shoulder. He noted with infuriating calmness that they possessed a fully functional, heavily armed Imperial dropship parked on the surface, courtesy of the men who had just tried to kill them. He added that while bypassing a planetary blockade was statistically improbable for a standard vessel, a ship wrapped in a localized, gravity-bending stealth field might remain entirely undetected by conventional sensors. Valeriana stared at the human, the sheer audacity of his plan warring with the absolute desperation of their situation. He was proposing they fly a stolen ship straight into the heart of the most heavily defended airspace in the galaxy, relying solely on ancient, volatile technology that was currently leaking from his newly repaired neural port. If they failed, they would be vaporized by orbital defense cannons before they ever saw the sky of her home world. If the neural port ruptured during the stealth transit, Rex would suffer a catastrophic biological meltdown, leaving them stranded in hostile space. But as she looked into his cold, unwavering eyes, she realized the human from the dead world had just offered her the only strategy that mattered. They were not going to hide. They were going to bring the war directly to Malakor's doorstep. Stealing a heavily armed Imperial dropship from a squad of dead commandos was the simple part of the plan. Piloting that stolen vessel straight into the teeth of a planetary blockade without being atomized required a suspension of reality that only a dead species could provide. Valeriana strapped herself into the co-pilot seat of the sleek, angular assault craft as the frozen winds of Aegis Prime battered the hull. The navigation console was firmly locked behind top-tier Imperial biometric scanners, a failsafe meant to prevent exactly what they were about to do. Rex did not bother looking for bypass codes. He simply pressed his bare palm against the primary data interface. A surge of violent violet energy flowed from his skin, shorting out the encryption grid in a shower of sparks and bringing the dark matter engines roaring to life. They launched from the shattered glacier, leaving the ruined safe house and the frozen hunters far below. As the dropship breached the upper atmosphere and prepared for the transit to the capital world of Ethelgard, Rex unsealed the heavy collar of his salvaged flight jacket. He placed both hands flat on the central navigational dash, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute concentration. The metallic scars on his neck flared with a blinding intensity, illuminating the cramped cockpit in a harsh, unnatural light. He was not just interfacing with the ship, he was extending his localized gravity anomaly outward, pushing the limits of his ancient biology to wrap the entire hull of the dropship in a continuous, bending field. He was manually warping light, thermal signatures, and radar waves completely around them. To the universe, they were a ghost. To Rex, it was a staggering, agonizing physical toll. The journey across the sector took 9 grueling hours. The cockpit was bathed in the dim red glow of the stealth instrumentation. The only sound the low, vibrating hum of the engines and Rex's heavy, labored breathing. Valeriana watched him in the dim light. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead, his knuckles white against the console. He was holding the fundamental laws of physics at bay with his mind, bleeding his own synthetic biocoolant to keep them hidden from Malakor's fleets. Looking at him, a profound and sickening realization washed over the princess. She looked down at her own hands, the immaculate hands of royalty who had never known true hardship or forced labor, the pristine spires of her capital city, the endless hanging gardens of the upper atmosphere, the towering monuments celebrating her ancestors. They were all built on a foundation of inescapable cruelty. Her empire consumed lives like fuel. They ripped beings from their homeworlds, stripped them of their autonomy, and fused control chips to their spines to build a utopia for the elite. Rex was a victim of a systemic, galactic rot that she had blindly accepted her entire life as the natural order of the cosmos. The absolute monstrosity of the Ethelgard slave trade was no longer an abstract economic policy discussed in the High Council chambers. It was sitting right next to her, slowly burning itself out to save her life and secure her throne. The guilt felt like a physical weight on her chest. She had bought him, even if her intentions were survival. She had participated in the very system that had reduced a magnificent ancient warrior into an expendable commodity. Valeriana unbuckled her safety harness and moved quietly across the cramped space. She knelt beside his pilot chair, completely ignoring the rigorous protocols of royal separation. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the edge of his jaw, wiping away a streak of dark coolant that had leaked from his repaired neural port. Rex opened his eyes, the cold, steel-gray irises softening ever so slightly as he looked down at her. He warned her softly, his voice a rough gravel, that breaking his concentration could result in sudden molecular decimation by the orbital defense grid they were rapidly approaching. Valeriana did not pull her hand away. She met his gaze directly and told him that when she retook the throne, the very first decree she would sign would be the absolute eradication of the slave registries. She swore to him, not as a princess making a political promise to a subject, but as a woman swearing a blood oath to an equal, that no living being would ever wear a control collar in her empire again. Rex studied her face, his advanced optics searching for the deception and arrogance he had been programmed to expect from her kind. He found none. The invisible wall of ice he had built around his humanity over centuries of servitude finally cracked. He leaned his cheek into the palm of her hand. A simple, deeply vulnerable gesture that completely shattered the established power dynamic between them. He spoke quietly, revealing that his original designation was not a number, but a name chosen by a mother he could barely remember from a blue world he would never see again. He told her his name was Arthur. Valeriana smiled, a genuine expression of warmth in the cold cabin, noting the profound irony that she had arbitrarily named him Rex, the ancient word for king. Arthur requested she keep calling him Rex, stating it was the first time in his existence a title was given to him with respect rather than malice. In that quiet, suspended moment, millions of miles from the world that broke him, the master and the slave ceased to exist entirely, replaced by two warriors bound by a fierce, undeniable spark of love. The tender connection was violently interrupted by the proximity alarms flashing a silent, urgent yellow. They had reached the Ethelgard capital. Through the viewport, the sprawling, gilded ecumenopolis covered the entire surface of the planet, a glittering jewel of unimaginable wealth and oppression. The orbital blockade was a dense, terrifyingly impenetrable web of dreadnoughts, defense platforms, and automated minefields. Rex gritted his teeth, tearing his gaze away from Valeriana as the violet light pushing from his scars reached a blinding crescendo. He guided the stolen dropship through the microscopic gaps in the sensor nets, grazing the massive hulls of Imperial capital ships so closely that Valeriana could read their serial registries etched into the armor plating. It was a masterclass in spatial awareness and sheer unadulterated willpower. They slipped through the blockade entirely undetected, diving past the pristine upper levels of the city and plunging into the dense, smog-choked lower atmosphere of the industrial sector. Valeriana directed him toward the subterranean maintenance shafts that fed directly into the foundations of the royal palace. These ancient, colossal tunnels were unmonitored by military sensors, meant only for automated repair drones and waste management. As the dropship navigated the massive labyrinthine pipes deep beneath the glittering surface, a sudden, terrifying change came over Rex. He violently pulled his hands away from the navigational console, gasping for air as if he had been plunged into freezing water. The dropship shuddered violently, the localized stealth field flickering and failing instantly. Valeriana lunged across the cockpit, grabbing the manual controls and barely stabilizing the craft before it slammed into a thick concrete bulkhead. She slammed the thrusters in reverse, settling the ship onto a hidden maintenance platform, and spun around to face Rex in sheer panic. He was convulsing in the pilot seat, his hands clutching the sides of his head. The metallic scars on his neck were no longer glowing their signature. Warm, violet. They were flashing a harsh, aggressive, and highly erratic crimson. They had breached the immediate perimeter of the royal sanctum. The core of the palace was heavily saturated with the highest-tier Imperial command signals. A localized, overpowering frequency blanket designed to ensure absolute, unquestioning subservience from the thousands of genetically modified guards and servants within the walls. Rex's ancient Earth biology, despite its vast superiority, was fighting a losing war against the sheer, overwhelming proximity of the master control network. His patched neural port was acting as an antenna, funneling the tyrannical frequency directly into his brain. His original conditioning, the ruthless, emotionless combat protocols embedded in his mind by his anonymous creators centuries ago, were being forcibly triggered by the Imperial signal. The man who had just shared his true name, the man who had just found a sliver of humanity and love in the dark void of space, was being systematically erased. He was being overridden by a cold, merciless killing machine program that did not recognize friend from foe, master from ally. Rex stopped convulsing. He slowly lowered his hands and stood up in the cramped cockpit, his movements terrifyingly stiff and mechanical. He looked down at Valeriana. His eyes were entirely devoid of humanity, shifting into a terrifying blank crimson that matched the glowing scars on his neck. He raised his right hand, his fingers curling slightly. The air between them instantly warped and distorted as a localized, lethal gravity anomaly formed in his palm, aimed directly at Valeriana's chest. A single thrust of his hand would crush her heart into a dense, unrecognizable sphere of carbon. Valeriana backed against the heavy console, trapped in the tiny cabin, staring into the face of the man she loved who was now programmed to execute her, wondering how she could possibly reach the human buried beneath the machine before he destroyed her. A machine built for mindless slaughter is a terrifying weapon, but a machine that actively chooses to remember its humanity is an unstoppable force of nature. Valeriana stood pinned against the cold metal of the dropship console, the deadly crimson glow of Rex's neural port casting harsh, bloody shadows across the cramped cockpit. The gravity anomaly in his palm hummed with a lethal, concentrated density, inches from her chest. He was fully submerged in the suffocating depths of the Imperial command signal, his ancient combat protocols demanding the immediate execution of an unauthorized target. She did not reach for her plasma pistol. She did not brace for the crushing impact. Instead, she took a deliberate step forward, closing the microscopic distance between them, and placed her unarmored hand directly over his glowing, trembling fingers. She looked into his blank, blood-red eyes and spoke his true name, Arthur, with a voice entirely devoid of fear and anchored in absolute, unwavering trust. The single word struck him harder than an orbital bombardment. The crimson light flashing across his metallic scars stuttered violently. The cold, mathematical certainty of his programming collided with the warm, chaotic memory of a blue sky, a mother's voice, and the profound, recent touch of a woman who saw him as an equal. The sheer, terrifying willpower of an earth-born warrior raged against the chains of a tyrannical frequency. Rex clenched his jaw, his muscles locking in agonizing rigidity as he forced his own cybernetics into submission. He crushed the lethal gravity anomaly in his palm, dissolving it into a harmless shower of static electricity. The red glare in his eyes fractured, fading back to the battered, familiar steel gray, and the scars on his neck settled into a bruised, pulsing violet. He dropped his hand, taking a heavy, ragged breath, and noted in his signature deadpan tone that standard Imperial network security was an invasive nuisance, and he apologized for the temporary homicidal glitch. Valeriana let out a breath she felt she had been holding for a century, a fierce smile breaking across her face. The Empire had tried to erase him, but the man had broken the machine. Now, it was time to break the Empire. They abandoned the dropship in the hidden maintenance bay and ascended through the labyrinthine foundations of the royal palace. They bypassed the heavily guarded central elevators, opting instead for an ancient high-velocity gravity lift reserved strictly for emergency royal evacuations. They shot upward through the miles of reinforced durasteel and gilded architecture, the pressure building in their ears as they approached the apex of the planetary capital. The High Council chamber was the undisputed seat of galactic power. A massive domed amphitheater constructed of polished white marble and transparent hyperglass that overlooked the sprawling, glittering ecumenopolis. Inside, Lord Malachor was standing before the grand, vacant throne, flanked by hundreds of elite Praetorian guards in heavy ceremonial armor. The chamber was packed with neutral senators, sector governors, and military elite, all watching as Malachor broadcast his solemn, perfectly crafted lies to the billions of citizens across the planetary network, painting himself as the grieving savior taking the mantle of a murdered emperor. He was halfway through his inaugural decree when the impenetrable durasteel doors of the main entrance simply ceased to exist. Rex did not bother looking for the access panel. He stepped out of the gravity lift, placed both of his bare hands flat against the massive 50-ton doors, and inverted the localized gravitational pull. The doors did not blast inward, they folded outward, groaning and tearing like cheap parchment before being violently sucked into the corridor walls. The deafening screech of tearing metal echoed through the cavernous chamber, instantly silencing Malachor's broadcast. The smoke cleared to reveal Princess Valeriana striding through the ruined archway, her royal cape flowing behind her, completely unharmed and radiating an aura of absolute authority. Beside her walked a man who should not exist, a battered, scarred ghost from a dead world, his hands glowing with a terrifying violet light. Malachor's face drained of color, his perfectly manicured composure shattering in an instant. He screamed for the Praetorian guards to execute the traitors. A brutal high-octane battle erupted as 200 of the Empire's finest killers surged forward, their energy pikes humming and plasma repeaters charging. Rex stepped in front of Valeriana, a solitary shield against a tidal wave of armored violence. He did not fight like a brawler, he fought like a conductor directing a symphony of kinetic destruction. The first squad of guards charged in a tight phalanx. Rex stamped his foot against the polished marble floor. The gravity directly beneath the advancing guards violently shifted 90 degrees. The entire squad was suddenly pulled sideways, slamming into the grand pillars of the chamber with the force of a high-speed collision, their armor crumpling instantly. Another contingent opened fire from the upper balconies, raining down a relentless barrage of superheated plasma fire. Rex raised his arms, weaving a complex web of dense gravitational pockets in the air above them. The plasma bolt struck the invisible anomalies and became trapped, swirling furiously in tight, compressed circles. With a sharp twist of his wrists, Rex reversed the polarity, hurling the trapped energy back at the balconies with devastating accuracy, shattering the marble balustrades and sending the snipers tumbling into the chaos below. He moved with impossible fluidity, tearing weapons from hands with localized magnetic pulls and crushing heavy chest plates with invisible, localized pressure pins. He was a flawless engine of defense, ensuring that not a single spark of energy or shrapnel came within 10 feet of the princess. While Rex tore through the supposedly impenetrable royal guard, Valeriana used the path he cleared to stride directly toward the central command lectern at the heart of the chamber. The senators and sector governors scrambled out of her way in sheer terror and awe. She did not look at the ensuing slaughter. She kept her eyes locked on the sweating, panicked face of Lord Malachor. She reached the console, slammed her palm onto the biometric scanner to assert her royal override, and plunged the stolen, decrypted data drive into the main port. She possessed a sharp, unforgiving political acumen, and she weaponized it flawlessly. With a flurry of keystrokes, she hijacked Malachor's planetary broadcast. The massive holographic banners hanging from the domed ceiling, which had been displaying Malachor's benevolent visage, suddenly flickered and changed. They displayed the raw, unedited security footage of Malachor's assassins injecting the synthetic neurotoxin into her father's life support feed. The footage was accompanied by the scrolling, undeniable data streams of his encrypted orders, his troop movements, and his precise plan to frame the princess. Valeriana activated the central amplification system, her voice ringing out across the chamber and echoing into the homes of billions across the planet. She did not plead her case. She stated the absolute, irrefutable truth. She exposed Malachor not just as a traitor, but as a coward who used poison and lies to steal a throne he was entirely unfit to hold. The neutral council members, who moments before had been ready to pledge their loyalty to the usurper, stared at the horrific truth displayed above them. The murmurs of shock quickly escalated into shouts of outrage. Malachor's political support, painstakingly built over decades of manipulation, vaporized in a matter of seconds. The tide of power shifted completely. But how the elite would react to her impending decree regarding the vast foundational slave registries remained a dangerous, unresolved variable. Malachor saw his empire crumbling before his eyes, cornered, exposed, and entirely out of options. The facade of the cunning statesman vanished, replaced by the cornered desperation of a tyrant. He scrambled backward up the steps of the dais, frantically punching a sequence into the armrest of the gilded throne. The floor directly behind the throne dropped away, revealing a heavily shielded subterranean panic room. Malachor threw himself into the bunker, the thick blast doors sealing him safely inside. But he did not intend to hide and wait for arrest. As the doors sealed, a secondary sequence initiated. The massive polished marble floor in the center of the chamber began to grind open, massive gears turning deep within the palace foundations. A heavy, suffocating scent of ozone and burning machine oil flooded the room. Rising slowly from the depths was a nightmare of illegal, unregulated engineering. It was a Leviathan-class experimental war mech, a towering bipedal monstrosity bristling with rotary plasma cannons, heavy artillery pods, and layered in crackling, impenetrable void shielding. It was a weapon strictly banned by the Galactic Accords, designed solely to level entire cities. The mechanical giant locked its massive, glowing targeting lasers directly onto Valeriana, who stood entirely exposed at the central console. The remaining Praetorian guards fled the chamber in terror, recognizing that the machine would indiscriminately slaughter anything in its path. Rex turned away from the fleeing guards, his chest heaving, his violet scars burning fiercely as he stepped between the princess and the towering metal titan, facing a weapon that even ancient Earth biology might not be able to withstand. A war mech designed to crack the tectonic plates of rebellious worlds is a subtle diplomatic tool only if you consider total planetary annihilation a negotiation tactic. For the man who had just broken an empire's entire control network with a single memory, it was merely the final obstacle standing between a princess and her rightful throne. The Leviathan-class war mech fully emerged from the subterranean launch bay, its massive hydraulic footfalls cracking the polished marble of the High Council chamber with every agonizing step. It stood 3 stories tall, a walking fortress of blackened durasteel and glowing supercharged energy conduits. Its rotary plasma cannons spun up with a sickening, accelerating whine, locking onto Valeriana, who stood entirely exposed at the central command lectern. The remaining senators and elite military officials who had not fled the chamber threw themselves behind the heavy stone balustrades of the upper balconies, realizing too late that their political neutrality would not save them from indiscriminate, mechanized slaughter. Rex did not wait for the machine to open fire. He launched himself forward, closing the distance with unnatural, terrifying speed, leaving cracked marble in his wake. The violet light pulsing from his cybernetic scars shifted into a blinding, searing white, a visual testament to the catastrophic drain on his biological core. He was no longer regulating his power. He was bleeding it out in a massive, uncontrolled surge. He raised both hands, creating a localized gravity wall just as the mech unleashed a torrent of superheated plasma. The energy splashed against the invisible barrier like water hitting a solid rock, deflecting outward and melting the grand, ancient columns of the chamber into glowing, formless pools of slag. Valeriana did not flinch as the blistering heat washed over her face. She knew Rex could not hold off a city-leveling weapon indefinitely. She dove beneath the ruined central command console, her fingers flying across the holographic interface. Malicor's panic room was shielded by a military-grade quantum lock, drawing its power directly from the palace's immense geothermal core. She had to sever that connection to pry the traitor from his hole. And she had to do it before the human fighting for her life was burned out completely. Stray artillery shells from the mech's shoulder pods detonated against the walls above her, raining jagged shrapnel and heavy chunks of marble down onto the console. She ignored the debris bouncing off her armored corset, her mind hyper-focused on the scrolling lines of code, systematically dismantling the security grid layer by layer, utilizing every backdoor protocol her grandfather had secretly built into the palace mainframe. The Leviathan took a thunderous step forward, its advanced sensory arrays tracking Rex's movements. The machine calculated his defensive perimeter and instantly adapted, firing a cluster of subterranean concussion mines from its lower chassis, designed to burrow under energy shields and detonate from below. Rex sensed the minute shift in the floor's density beneath his boots. He dropped his forward gravity shield and vaulted into the air, manipulating his own personal mass to launch himself 40 feet upward into the cavernous space of the domed chamber. The mines detonated directly beneath where he had been standing, blowing a massive, smoking crater into the floor and sending a kinetic shockwave that knocked the hiding senators flat on the distant balconies. Hanging suspended in the air, Rex focused his attention on the mech's crackling void shielding. It was a shimmering, translucent blue sphere designed to deflect orbital railgun strikes, but it operated on a rigid, uniform frequency. Rex did not try to punch through it with sheer force. He sought to tear it apart from the inside. He extended his arms, targeting the microscopic space between the mech's heavy armor plating and the energy shield itself. He created a rapid, oscillating field of alternating gravity, pulling and pushing the air molecules within that millimeter of space at impossible speeds. The extreme friction ignited the air, turning the tiny gap into a localized, highly volatile plasma storm. The void shield, unable to process or defend against an attack originating from inside its own defensive perimeter, overloaded in a spectacular, blinding flash of blue energy, blowing outward and leaving the mechanical titan completely exposed to physical damage. The immense physical exertion was costing the human dearly. The brilliant white light bleeding from his neck began to flicker erratically, replaced by the ominous, aggressive crimson of failing system warnings. Thick, dark synthetic coolant leaked freely from his nose, his ears, and the edges of his repaired neural port, dripping down his neck and staining his battered flight jacket. His internal temperature was skyrocketing, his synthetic organs threatening to shut down entirely under the immense thermal load of channeling such devastating, physics-breaking power. He was drowning in his own biology, but he refused to stop. He dropped from the air, landing heavily on the shattered marble directly in front of the colossal machine, his boots sliding against the dust and debris. Beneath the console, Valeriana severed the third firewall, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The heat in the chamber was becoming suffocating, the air thick with the toxic smell of vaporized stone, burning machine oil, and ozone. She could hear the catastrophic strain in Rex's movements, the heavy, wet sound of his breathing echoing through the ruined hall during the brief lulls in weapon fire. She shouted his name over the din of battle, her voice carrying a raw, unguarded desperation, urging him to hold on for just a few more seconds. She bypassed the final biometric lock, her fingers bleeding from the jagged console debris, and rerouted the power flow from the panic room's shield generators directly into the city's municipal waste grid. The heavy blast doors beneath the throne hissed loudly, the complex locking mechanisms disengaging with a loud, satisfying clunk that echoed across the ruined floor. The Leviathan, stripped of its shielding and registering critical threats, engaged its primary physical weapon. A massive monomolecular siege blade extended from its right forearm, a weapon capable of slicing cleanly through capital ship hulls. The mech swung the glowing blade in a devastating, horizontal arc, aiming to cut Rex entirely in half and level the central console behind him. Rex did not attempt to dodge. He stood his ground, planting his boots firmly into the cracked floor, his crimson-lit eyes tracking the incoming strike. As the massive blade approached, sweeping through the air with a terrifying hum, he brought both of his bleeding hands together in a thunderous clap. He did not target the invincible blade. He targeted the massive hydraulic elbow joint of the mech's swinging arm. He compressed the gravity in a sphere the size of a melon directly inside the joint's internal workings. The supposedly impenetrable durasteel crumpled inward like cheap tin foil. The sheer kinetic force of the mech's own violent swing, combined with the sudden catastrophic structural failure of its arm, caused the massive limb to tear itself completely free from the main chassis. The severed arm spun through the air and crashed into the far wall, taking down a massive centuries-old tapestry of the Imperial crest in a shower of sparks and dust. Rex did not give the machine a fraction of a second to recalculate its targeting parameters. He lunged into the opening, pressing his bare, bleeding hands directly against the exposed, glowing core casing embedded in the mech's massive chest. He poured every last ounce of his rapidly failing energy into one final, violent pulse. He did not push the gravity outward, he pulled it inward. He created a localized, terrifying singularity directly inside the war mech's power plant. The massive machine let out a horrific mechanical scream as its heavy internal components were violently crushed together into a space no larger than a marble. The immense, impossible pressure imploded the mech from the inside out. The towering legs buckled, the chassis warped and folded, and the massive torso collapsed into a smoking, dense pile of fused metal and dead circuitry, shaking the entire palace foundation as it hit the floor. As the colossal machine fell, Valeriana lunged from her cover beneath the console. She sprinted across the ruined chamber, her boots slipping on the slick marble, drawing her plasma pistol. She reached the disengaged blast doors of the panic room and kicked them open with a massive surge of adrenaline. Lord Malachor was huddled in the darkest corner of the subterranean bunker, clutching a useless dead communication device. His face was a mask of absolute paralyzing terror. He looked up at the princess, expecting the immediate, fiery execution he had so meticulously planned for her. Valeriana stood over him, her royal armor heavily scorched, her cape torn, and her face smeared with ash and blood. She radiated the cold, unforgiving, and absolute authority of a true empress. She aimed the pistol directly at his forehead, her finger tight on the trigger. She did not shoot him. She lowered the weapon, informing him in a voice that carried to the listening senators above that execution was a swift mercy reserved for honorable warriors. She told him that he would spend the rest of his natural life in the darkest, coldest cell of the deepest asteroid prison in the Ethelgard Empire, kept alive solely to watch her systematically dismantle every cruel, corrupt system he had ever built or profited from. She grabbed the whimpering traitor by the collar of his ruined, gilded ceremonial robes and dragged him out into the smoking ruins of the High Council chamber. She threw him violently to the floor before the stunned, silent senators, securing her throne and her vengeance in a single, undeniable action. She had won. The usurper was captured. The broadcast had revealed the truth to billions, and the empire was saved from a tyrant. But the taste of absolute victory instantly turned to ash in her mouth. A heavy, sickening thud echoed behind her, devoid of any mechanical hum or energy crackle. It was simply the sound of dead weight hitting stone. Valeriana spun around, dropping her pistol entirely. Rex had fallen. The man who had shattered elite assassins, bent the fabric of space and crushed a mechanical titan with his bare hands, was lying completely motionless on the cracked marble floor. The brilliant, terrifying light that had pulsed from his cybernetic scars was completely extinguished, leaving only cold, dark metal woven into bruised flesh. His massive chest was entirely still, and a thick pool of dark synthetic coolant was rapidly expanding around his head. He had pushed his ancient, salvaged biology far past its absolute breaking point to secure her future. Fully knowing and accepting that it would cost him his own, Valeriana dropped to her knees beside him, the polished floor biting into her skin. Her perfect royal composure, maintained through assassinations, betrayals, and planetary blockades, finally and completely shattered. She pulled his heavy, lifeless head into her lap, screaming for her personal medical detachments to breach the chamber, wondering with a crushing, absolute certainty if the magnificent throne she had just bled to reclaim was worth anything at all in a vast, empty universe without the human who had won it for her. A crown is nothing but a heavy piece of gilded metal if the person who bled to secure it is no longer breathing. Princess Valeriana did not care that the High Council chamber was a smoking, ruined crater, or that the most powerful politicians in the galaxy were watching her weep over the motionless body of a registered laborer. She held Rex's head in her lap, the dark synthetic coolant staining her armored corset, screaming for the royal medical detachment. They breached the shattered durasteel doors moments later, a swarm of elite medics in pristine white armor that stood in stark contrast to the ash and destruction. They deployed a localized anti-gravity hover stretcher, rushing to the center of the room. The chief medical officer, a decorated veteran of the Imperial fleet, abruptly froze when his diagnostic scanner registered Rex's biological signature. He lowered his instrument and stammered, telling the princess that Imperial protocol strictly forbade the use of royal trauma facilities on unranked biological assets, let alone registered slave property. Valeriana did not argue with him. She gently lowered Rex to the floor, picked up her discarded plasma pistol, and leveled it directly at the officer's chest. She informed him with a chilling, absolute calm that if the man on the floor died, the entire medical detachment would be joining Lord Malachor in the deepest, coldest asteroid prison in the sector. The officer swallowed hard, immediately ordering his team to load the human onto the stretcher. The Royal Surgical Theater was a marvel of Ethelgard engineering, a sterile, glowing dome of hard-light scalpel arrays and automated biological weavers. Valeriana stood behind the thick, transparent hyperglass of the observation deck, refusing to wash the soot and blood from her own face. She watched intently as a dozen of the galaxy's most brilliant surgeons scrambled to understand an anatomy that defied all known Imperial science. They were terrified of the dark, gravity-dense metal laced into his skeletal structure and the volatile violet energy that still pulsed weakly within his failing synthetic organs. Valeriana activated the internal comms and issued her final, absolute directive for the surgery. They were not just repairing the catastrophic thermal damage to his core. They were to completely excise the slaver's control chip fused to his upper spine, severing the deep-rooted neural tethers without destroying his central nervous system. It was a delicate, grueling procedure that took 14 agonizing hours. The surgeons had to navigate the ancient, superior Earth technology with crude Imperial instruments, treating his nervous system like a live thermonuclear warhead. The tension in the observation deck was suffocating. Every time the biometric monitors flared a harsh, warning red, Valeriana's heart stopped. She watched them finally pull the jagged, cruel piece of black metal from the base of his skull, dropping the bloody control chip into a sterile disposal unit. For the first time in centuries, the warrior from the dead world was completely untethered from the violent whims of a master. When the heavy blast doors of the recovery ward finally hissed open, Valeriana found Rex lying on a pristine, elevated diagnostic bed. The harsh metallic scars on his neck were gone, replaced by smooth, flawless synthetic skin seamlessly grafted by the medical weavers. His breathing was deep and even, the terrifying violet glow replaced by the steady, healthy rhythm of a biological heart. He opened his eyes, the irises a clear, sharp steel gray, completely free of the oppressive crimson command signals. He looked around the immaculate, glowing room, then looked at Valeriana, who was gripping the edge of the bed with white knuckles. He broke the heavy silence by noting in a dry, gravelly voice that imperial medical beds were excessively soft, inevitably leading to rapid muscle atrophy. And the pastel color scheme of the room was highly offensive to his visual sensors. Valeriana let out a sudden, breathless laugh that quickly turned into a heavy sob. She leaned down and buried her face in his broad shoulder, completely disregarding the lingering, stunned doctors. Rex hesitated for only a fraction of a second before bringing his heavy, muscular arm up to wrap around her waist, holding her with a fierce, protective warmth that required no programming at all. 2 weeks later, the sprawling capital of Ethelgard was fundamentally changed. The smoking craters of the High Council chamber had been cleared, and Lord Malakor's loyalists had been systematically rooted out of the military command structure. Dawn broke over the glittering Ecumenopolis, painting the hanging gardens and towering durasteel spires in brilliant shades of gold and amber. Valeriana stood on the grand balcony of the royal palace, overlooking a central plaza packed with millions of citizens, with billions more watching across the planetary broadcast network. She wore the elegant mantle of the Empress, a flowing garment of deep crimson and gold, but she had permanently discarded the heavy, restrictive crown of her ancestors. Standing directly beside her, not a single step behind, was Rex. He wore the sleek, dark armor of the newly formed Royal Vanguard, but his uniform bore no insignias of servitude or rank. He was simply Arthur, a free man of Earth, and the most dangerous entity in the known universe, standing as a silent, unwavering pillar of strength at the right hand of the Empress. Valeriana stepped up to the amplification node. Her voice was steady, resonating with profound clarity across the heavy silence of the massive crowd. She did not speak of tax reforms or border expansions. She spoke of the dark, festering rot that had sustained their beautiful world for far too long. She declared that an empire built on the broken backs of the enslaved was not an empire at all, but a gilded cage waiting to collapse under its own cruelty. With a single forceful keystroke on the royal ledger, she executed her very first sovereign decree. She initiated a galaxy-wide system purge, instantly dissolving the imperial slave registries. Across 1,000 star systems, the brutal control collars locked around the necks of millions of beings simultaneously powered down and snapped open. She warned the syndicates and the flesh peddlers hiding in the shadows of the black markets that the full, unyielding wrath of the Ethelgard armada would now rain down upon anyone who dared to trade in sentient life. A massive, deafening roar of absolute shock and overwhelming triumph erupted from the plaza below, a tidal wave of genuine liberation that shook the very foundations of the planet. Later that evening, the grand celebrations echoing through the city streets below were a distant, pleasant hum. Valeriana and Rex stood alone on the highest observation deck of the palace, the cool night air rushing past them. The stars above were bright, a vast ocean of possibilities no longer tainted by cruelty and oppression. Rex leaned against the hyperglass railing, his posture relaxed for the first time in his long, violent existence. He looked at the woman beside him, his steel eyes softening with a profound, undeniable affection. He told her quietly that Earth was a beautiful world before the fire. But looking at the new empire she was building, he finally felt like he had found a reason to stop fighting the universe and simply live in it. Valeriana smiled, reaching out to intertwine her fingers with his. The princess who bought a weapon had found a partner, and the slave who destroyed an army had found his humanity. Together, they looked out over the glittering free world, ready to face whatever the galaxy threw at them next, not as master and servant, but as equals. Thank you all so much for watching this epic journey. If you enjoyed this story of rebellion, ancient power, and breaking the chains of the galaxy, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share the video with your friends. Drop the word liberation in the comments below to let me know you made it to the very end. And make sure to hit that hype button so the algorithm knows to push this video to more hardcore sci-fi fans just like you.